You are listening to episode 97 of In Film We Trust. I'm Liam.
I'm Wayne.
A weekly podcast where we discuss, dissect, and deep dive all things film, from the obscure to the mainstream.
And now, on with the show.
Before the mainstream acceptance of tattoos in the post-Miami Ink years, there stood Jonathan Shaw, an outlaw within the tattoo world, being the founder of New York's very first tattoo parlor, Fun City. But this isn't the only element to mark a life lived to the full. Growing up in 1950s Hollywood to famous parents, Shaw broke out from the Hollywood trap and seeked adventure across the continents, and is here to tell the story. One of fame, money, destitution, addiction, and, well, you can stay tuned to see where the story goes from there, as we'll be detailing the new documentary, Scab Vendor, Confessions of a Tattoo Artist, that was adapted from his first memoir. Because, oh yeah, he was also a successful author. So hang around with us as we traverse the highs, the rock bottoms, the glitz, the scuzz, and the redemption of Jonathan Shaw.
Well, folks, this is one we've been looking forward to for some time now, so please join us in welcoming the sensei of skin art, the installer of ink, the scab vendor himself, Jonathan Shaw. Welcome to the In Film We Trust podcast, Jonathan. How are you this fine day?
I'm very, very, very well. Thanks for asking, and happy to be here with you. I know it's taken a long time to finally coordinate our efforts, but here we are, and looking forward to this.
Sometimes the best things are worth waiting for. And I can't help seeing that it looks very much nice and sunny where you are, because I know you spend half of your year in Brazil, but are you in LA at the moment, I believe?
I am indeed.
How's that going? Because I know you're currently on tour for the documentary we're discussing today, Scab Vendor, Confessions of a Tattoo Artist. How's that going? You're showing it at theaters. It's currently on Amazon Prime and other places. How's the tour going?
Well, I was on tour. I'm usually on tour with the tattooing. I go around the country, in the U.S. mostly between, the warmer months, summer and spring and into the fall. So probably I'd say about 9 months out of the year, I'm usually on tour in North America and a bit of Mexico in the warm months. So in that time period, I'm usually on tour just, driving cross country back and forth, visiting many tattoo studios from, all across this giant country. From the East Coast to the West Coast, from the southern border to the northern border, all over the USA. So I'm usually doing that in those summer months anyway, at least for the last few years since I came back to tattooing. But this year was a bit different because we set it up to sort of coincide the somewhat unusually usual tattoo touring with the theatrical release of the movie in 10 different cities across the USA. So it was a bit like trying to herd mosquitoes, trying to figure out, how to coincide the tattoo tours with the different studios and at the same time, hit the movie premieres that were taking place in the various, different cities along the way. So it was a bit of a challenge, trying to pull everything together in some sort of coordinated fashion. It was a lot of fun. I mean, it was definitely a lot of fun. But somehow we made it all happen, and it's been a great time, So that tour is now, at least the movie part of the tour is now concluded. So the theatrical release of the movie, that's pretty much ended, and now it is available on streaming platforms and all that, at least in North America, in the US and Canada. But the tattoo tour continues to rage on as these things do.
Because this current documentary is an adaptation, essentially, of your first memoir, Scab Vendor, Confessions of a Tattoo Artist, which I believe came out in 2017. Now, this documentary is co-directed by Lucas de Barros and Mariana Thomé. I hope I'm saying that correctly. How did they become involved in the project?
Well, they didn't become involved. I became involved.
Oh.
It's Lucas is a guy that I knew from Brazil, sort of peripherally. I traveled around Brazil on a motorcycle a lot, and we
Yeah.
sort of knew of each other, but we didn't really personally know each other. And at one point, I was riding across South America on a motorcycle, and at the time, that's a long time ago. My God, over 10 years ago. And I just sort of, I was putting stuff up. It was on Facebook at the time, where I would sort of post what city I was going to be going near to next, and seeing if anybody, I knew was around, so I could stop and say hello, or maybe have lunch with somebody. I was just touring across South America on the motorcycle, and Lucas saw my Facebook post, and he said, "Oh, we sort of know each other from Facebook and this and that. And if you'd like to stop through my town and have lunch or something." And we met up. It was actually he was filming something in a small town on the border of Paraguay and Brazil, and we just sort of found each other like that. And we were talking, and he'd seen bits of my books and this and that. And he said, "Well, you're an interesting guy. You have an interesting life. I'd be interested in making a documentary about you." And, I said yes, as I generally do to most things. Then the whole thing just sort of went away, and I went about my life. And I don't know, maybe 6, 8, 9, 10 months later, I was maybe a year later, I don't know, I was in Los Angeles, and my first book, called Narcissa, was being released on HarperCollins, a big publisher over here. And so I started doing sort of bookstore appearances and doing some sort of promotional things for that book release. And I was doing a reading / sort of spoken word performance at an art gallery here in Los Angeles, a very iconic place called La Luz de Jesus Gallery. That's where a lot of my favorite artists have shown their work. Guys like Joe Coleman and Robert Williams, and a lot of...
Who are your friends?
Yeah, they're also my friends and my favorite artists and my dear friends. I was doing a book signing and reading sort of thing at this art gallery, and tons of people were there. And Lucas, he got word of this, and he said, "Oh, I'd like to send over," he couldn't leave Brazil for whatever reasons. He didn't have any money, and nobody had any money. But he said he wanted to send a film crew with some kids over here, and they filmed it. They started compiling material to, it was very haphazard. They had no money. He was used to a bunch of film students. So it was, haphazardly done over the subsequent years. And, there was a lot of starts and stops, and the people would run out of money, and then, the project would stop. And so, this is why it wound up taking almost 10 years to make this thing, because, they were really working with very little resources. And, somehow, which I think is sort of code language for the grace of God, somehow this thing managed to come together against all odds.
So you say it was put together in this kind of haphazard way because of all these external forces like lack of budget and lack of experience. How did you originally envision it would go? Because I like how it's put together with clips of you and there's film clips and that fantastic, like hand-drawn art style. Absolutely love that. A great way to kind of bridge the scenes. Is that how you originally envisioned it happening, or did it change, as it went along with these external circumstances?
Well, I didn't really have a vision. I just, trusted the universe and, trusted Lucas, because, his co-director really didn't have any real vision for a story. And, but Lucas, he had a lot of filmmakers, sort of experience and ideas. Yeah. And so I didn't really have a vision of this thing. I just know my story, and I know my life, and I know my work, and I know my books. And so I know that, but I didn't have a particular vision of how this thing would be. I just wanted to ensure that it would be true to to what I'm trying to do, as a storyteller and as an artist. But I didn't have any particular vision. I tried to work with them and impart, whatever realities, from my point of perspective, to Lucas, so that the thing could be true to my overall vision as just an artist. But I didn't really have any vision of how a movie should be made. I just wanted to make sure that it would be true to my perspective of as an artist, as a writer, as a storyteller. So at one point they'd compiled loads of material, interviews, follow me around, B-roll, all sorts of stuff. They'd compiled, dozens of hours of material. And at one point, early on in the thing, they called for a sit down to show me a rough cut of something that they thought, I don't think Lucas was even there for this, but, some of the other people involved at the time were, and they showed me this rough cut, and it was just absolutely abhorrent. It was horrible. It was just like something that a 22-year-old film student would put together, and call it, filmmaking.
Okay.
And I saw this thing, and I was like, absolutely fucking not. This is not in any way acceptable. This is bullshit. This is self-indulgent amateur, and this will not go forward. If I have anything to say about it, which I do, because I made sure I'm in my contract, I had
You had final cut
approval,
creative control.
To some extent anyway, with a reasonable extent, but definitely I could pull the plug on this thing if that's what they were going to put out. And I told them on no uncertain terms, this is not a film. This is bullshit. I won't have my name on this, and you're not gonna go forward with this. I had the idea of saying to them, well, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go into, the murky swamps of Hollywood, and you're going to have to find a professional story editor who works on real movies to help you weave all this, all this footage that you've made, which is fine. The footage in itself is fine, but you're going to need the help of somebody who knows how to tell a story to edit this mass of material into a actual coherent, cohesive story. You're going to have to hire a professional story editor who works in cinema.
How does Lucas take that?
Well, Lucas was fine with it. And the story editor sat down and read all my books and read also a screenplay that I'd written for Johnny Depp based on my books many years before. And she just sorted through all my written material and everything that I had put together story-wise. And and then with that research done, she went through all the footage and pieced it together into something that very nicely represented my life's work in a really good way. So, and then and then it was just a matter of fine tuning and adding voiceovers and scraps of my books, and she gave them an outline for making this massive material into a movie that is the one that you eventually would see. And then Lucas put in his sort of creative genius final touches, like with the animation and some of the creative editing and the sort of fast-paced montages and all that sort of things, most of which I think was very successful. There was a couple of bits that I would have liked to have seen done differently, but at the end of the day, they didn't, at some point, they didn't refer to me a lot. Once I'd sort of put my foot down and said, look, you got to have a creative, story editor involved, or I'm going to fuck you all up the ass sideways. Once that happened, I think they got scared of me and they tried to keep me at arm's length as much as possible.
Yeah. That maybe it ended up in it being more interesting, though, with, this almost, I wouldn't say a compromise, but this clashing of two different points of view, shall we say. And like there's maybe elements you said that you thought maybe could have been done a little better, but it adds this whole, this whole visual aesthetic, because I think it terrifically works.
No, the only thing that I really didn't like that they could have done better had they had the humility to consult me about certain things. There was only two things that where they failed, and that's not a bad record when you think of all the fuckery that could have taken place.
Well,
But there was they failed in two areas. The one area, which is a minor area, where they have all that scribbling, around the some of the imagery.
were you not a
I thought
fan?
the script, there's scribbles. There's like scratchy scribbles. And I think that scratchy scribble could have very nicely been replaced by some of the crazy artwork that I do, those patterns that I do, as
Yeah.
opposed to just random scribbling, which was, there was an art director who was a friend of one of the producers, the main producer who put up the money. And I guess, he put this person to work
Yeah.
scribbling all over my fucking archives, which I thought was stupid because if they would have given it to me, I could have made some, interesting tribal patterns instead of just scratchy scribble that looks like a 5-year-old, scratched all over the stuff. That
Do you
I
know what
thought
that
was
is, Jonathan? Do you know what that
Yeah.
is? That is Hollywood. Something you know all too well. You are the only son of big band leader Artie Shaw and golden age of Hollywood actress Doris Dowling. And I know you have a contentious relationship with Hollywood. What was it like? Because a lot of, if in filmdom, there's a lot of glamorization about 1950s Hollywood. How do you see that being from that milieu?
I see it from the point of perspective of somebody who grew up in that, in that environment, and got a very good glimpse of it in all of its nuanced beauty and ugliness and horror. And I grew up in on a battlefield of spiritual sickness associated with
Yeah.
the sickness of my family of origin. I mean, if you've read my books,
Yep.
then you know that I grew up in in an alcoholic home. My mother was an insane alcoholic and also, a brilliant, beautiful soul that just couldn't navigate her own traumas from her own childhood. And so, I grew up in a really challenging environment,
Yeah.
to say the least. It was a lot of violence and craziness and abuse and, all that fun stuff. So being that was also in the glamorous heart of Hollywood. I mean, I didn't know from Hollywood. I was just a kid growing up in a horrible environment. It could have been Hollywood. It could have been the fucking favelas of Rio de Janeiro. It didn't matter. It was a horrible, dangerous place to grow up. So
If any of our listeners don't know the actress Doris Dowling, your mother, she was in the film noir The Blue Dahlia. She was also in Orson Welles' Othello, just to add context to that.
well, most importantly, as relates to my story, she was in the movie, in Billy Wilder's The Lost Weekend,
Yeah.
I love
which
that. I
I
love
grew
that
up
film.
with that.
Yeah.
Well, that wound up becoming interwoven with the story of my life.
Yeah.
The themes that were approached in The Lost Weekend became the themes by which my life would eventually sort of evolve. My
So-
destiny was closely interwoven.
Growing up in that household, growing up with like that parentage, from very kind of prestigious, famous background, was there kind of unrealistic expectations on you to maybe, go into the industry, becoming like a singer or a filmmaker or a
No.
musician? Was there expectations on you to do that?
No, I don't think there was any expectations on me one way or the other. I think I was raised by wolves, basically, and there was no expectations on me that I could discern one way or the other. The only expectation I derived from the whole sordid affair was to survive somehow, and that meant getting the fuck out of there at a very early age.
Well, that makes an important sense because in this film, what we're discussing, Scab Vendor, one of the important scenes is early in your formative years, you watched the film Black Orpheus by Marcel Camus. Now, this is a film that obviously takes place in Rio de Janeiro, and you explain in the documentary how it kind of made you want to get out of Hollywood, so to speak. And I was looking in your book, which I have, Homeward Bound, and I think this makes sense from chapter 15, No Direction Home, which is a quote by Henry Miller. And he says, "I hated the place I was born in. I will hate it till my dying day. My earliest impulse was to break loose from home, from the city I detested, from the country and its citizens with whom I felt nothing in common." Is that kind of what you were getting from Black Orpheus?
Oh, well, that's what I was getting from my own, the depths of my own soul and my dubious upbringing. So I hated everything and everybody and everything, associated with everything I knew. So, for me, there was that song by Steely Dan that it played a lot on the radio when I was an early teenager, where it said the verse was, "Any world that I'm welcome to is better than the one I came from."
Ooh, okay.
So that became sort of a theme song for my quest to just run from whatever was known as my reality. So, from a very early age, my goal was just to get the fuck out. I didn't know or care much how or where or, I would end up. I just knew that any world that I was welcome to, that was available to me in any way, shape, or form, would be infinitely better than the world that I came from and the world that I knew, because of, many stories and details that are outlined in my book, in Scab Vendor. The world that I was living in was the family and the society and the place and time and everything around me was just in every way, shape, and form completely unacceptable to my soul. To my soul in everything was just abhorrent to me in every way, shape, and form.
It was essentially an existential crisis.
I guess you could call it that.
So in those early days, you just wanted to get away. That was all you could think about, escaping. You didn't give much thought where you're going or whatever. Did you have any thought at all what you wanted to do, thinking, I'm going to get to wherever and I'm going to do something? Or was it just all about the escape?
Looking back in retrospect, there was what I would see from this point of perspective, two very important sort of milestones that, that would go on to shape my actual destiny. There was around the same time, as a very restless, irritated and discontent youth, living in this unacceptable reality, I came across, there was drugs and alcohol, which were a profound, escape valve for me in that situation. But then, in the midst of this swirling maelstrom of weirdness that became my life as an early teenager, I came across that film that you mentioned.
Black Orpheus.
But there was also a book that fell into my hands at a very early age by Jack Kerouac called On the Road.
Big fan.
And, I've spoken a lot about this book, in my writing. I've written a lot about how that book had a profound influence on me, in the sense that I was this confused, angry, discontented youth. And I saw, and I was just, yearning to find some escape valve from my unacceptable reality. And then this book fell in my hands and I read it. I devoured it. And On the Road became sort of like, a goal, a roadmap for me. It was like that. This guy has found, he's found a way out. He's found, he's found a foundation for living that suits me just fine. So I'm going to get out and stick out my thumb on the road and just go wherever the wind might take me. My maternal grandfather was a gypsy, and I've written about him extensively in the book. That desire to just run, make the highways and byways of, uncertain destiny my home, my only home. That was ingrained in my DNA, I think, and then that, that sort of combined with my need to escape in order to survive my circumstances, and it all just sort of turned into a confluence of circumstances that led to me taking to the road and making the road my home, and wherever the wind took me, that was going to be just fine. So at a very early age, I just stuck my thumb out on the highway, and without a pot to piss in or a window to throw it from, or 2 nickels to rub together, I ended up in Mexico, just being a hobo, traveling the dusty roads of Mexico for years, just sort of throwing my life into the hands of fate, as it were. And that through that, and I'd already seen Black Orpheus as well. So somewhere in the back of my consciousness, Brazil sort of represented a world that offered endless possibilities of romance and adventure to a young man, and I wound up getting work on a freighter in the port of Veracruz, Mexico.
Yeah.
And I wound up, working my way around South America on this ship, and eventually jumped ship in Brazil and did the same thing there. Just took off running into the hands of whatever would await me on this long, endless road to nowhere. And it's my life has been sort of like a kind of like a pinball, just going from one post to the other, and then
just wherever it takes you.
So that's kind of how things developed. And along that journey, somewhere along the line, I picked up the idea that tattooing, I always journaled and wrote. So I wrote a lot of notes along my travels when I was very young, a lot of which ended up later being sort of reconstituted into my books, when I, as a, 50-year-old man looking back over my life, I started, having reference from all these journals that I'd written along the road for many years. And, then I picked up tattooing, being a sailor and inhabiting sort of dockside dives and that sort of underworld in Central and South America. And so it all sort of wove together into, the fabric of my my destiny in a way that, can only be described as fortuitous.
Thinking of like moving around South America and like the romance of the road and the journey, would it be reasonable to assume that you were influenced, or at least some point later came across the Motorcycle Diaries by Che Guevara? Because I think that's one of the great road books.
No, I was totally unaware of that. Totally unaware of it. Didn't know it. Didn't give 2 shits about Che Guevara, or any of that. So no, I wound up seeing that, much later in life and not being terribly impressed, Yeah. So no, there's elements of his, adventures that might resonate somewhat with some of the realities that I live, but, I think my journey was infinitely more interesting than his, He
you stayed around longer.
I stayed around longer, and he ended up being a fucking deplorable communist, so that was never any of my, I was never interested in changing the world. I was not particularly idealistic in that sense. I was just I might have become that way later in life, but no, I didn't really relate much to that. And I didn't even know that existed until much, much later in life when they started making movies about it and that.
So something I didn't know about you, Jonathan, is your first foray into the visual arts in many aspects was through comic books like EC Comics, Zap, Crumb, which makes sense as Crumb done the artwork or gave you the artwork for Scab Vendor.
I guess somewhere in the middle 60s, well, even earlier, actually, when I was really young, probably 9 or 10 years old, I found comic books. Books became like an obsession for me, as most things in my life have always been. So I got obsessed with comic books, the EC comics of the day. They became a huge obsession for me, and I just devoured them. And at some point, I dreamed of becoming a comic book artist. And
that
so
makes
I
sense.
started, drawing. And I drew lots of little comic book panels, and did all that sort of thing. And then as time progressed and we got into the 60s, the whole psychedelic thing started happening, and along with that came Babcom, and that and I was doing, like everybody of that time and generation, and I already had this foundation of comic book, just sort of fluency with the medium of comic books. I just, I wasn't a great drawer, I wasn't a great artist, but I was definitely obsessed with the whole deal and trying to perfect my drawing skills on some level just by drawing a lot. And I wasn't very good, but I had a great love for that, for artistic expression. So I just loved the whole idea of comic books as a medium, because it combined everything I loved, imagery and story and writing and words and drawing. And I just thought, this is what I need to do. So I started, trying to make comic books of my own. And then the 60s came along, and then suddenly Zap Comics came out. And I was like, holy shit, I was doing a lot of acid at the time, so I was just dialed right into that culture.
Did that play into it? Did that make it seem better than it was?
Yeah, and then, then it was Robert Crumb.
Yeah. And,
I idolized Robert Crumb. Robert Crumb became like one of my main sort of idols. Just this guy was a god to me. And everything that he wrote, everything that he drew and designed and wrote, I just devoured it obsessively, like I had with the earlier comics of the EC comics and the Spider-Man and all that. But then when Zap Comics came along, it was a game changer, and I started reading, that stuff obsessively and got really involved in it. That was an ingredient, a very important ingredient in just the stew, of consciousness that brought me around eventually to tattooing, to writing, to storytelling, to living, just everything. It was just a very important milestone, the comics. So, so there was that. And, my life has been this surreal sort of journey in the sense that, everything, that I've ever sort of really encountered in life has always come around full circle in a way that's just so oddly fortuitous that, all those many years and decades later, I became an established, tattoo figure in, the underground scene in New York City back in a very important time. And then, through that whole association, one day, a mutual friend of mine and Robert Williams, who also became a great friend, and he was one of the original Zap comic artists as well, and I became good friends with Robert Williams. But I'd never met Crumb. And one day, a mutual friend of mine and Robert Williams, when I was running, Fun City Tattoo in New York, this, iconic underground tattoo mecca, one day, this mutual friend of Robert's and mine called me and said, hey, Robert Crumb's in town, and he wants to meet you because he knows you're friends with Robert Williams, and he wants to meet some cool people while he's here. Can I bring him over? I was like, my God. Bring him around. And he came over and we hit it off and we talked. We'd met once before at an art show that he did in New York, but it was a brief meeting. But now he was coming to my lair. So we rolled out the red carpet and we had a great meeting, and we started talking about different things. And, I started telling him a bunch of stories, and he said he wanted to do a portrait of me as an old man.
Oh, okay.
Tattooing. And so I gave him the dialogue, and he did the drawing of the old Scab Vendor. And that was how it was originally just a sketch, a really nice drawing that he did.
Oh yeah. Looks good.
And it was the size and shape of a book cover, and it was called The Old Scab Vendor. And I wrote the dialogue and he did the drawing. I set out the scenario of me tattooing some trendy cunt, wanting something really annoying, and me, just being this cynical old scab vendor. And so we made this thing together. We collaborated. I wrote it and, set up the sort of scenario, and he drew it. and that became the old Scab Vendor. So, many years later, when I finally had put together this book and got a book deal to publish it, I said, my God, we could use that as the cover for the book. And so I wrote to Plum. He was in France at that time. And I was like, Robert, would you be agreeable to me using that drawing you did as the cover for my book that's about to come out? And he said, well, send me the book. Send me the text of the book. I'd like to read through it. And he read the book. He was somewhat impressed. And he said, here's what I want to do. I want to take the original drawing that I did, and I want to colorize it and make it into an actual proper book cover for you. And I was like, my God, this was one of the high points of my life.
Something you idolized, and now he's working for you.
And now he's doing this thing for me, and he never charged me a penny for it. He just made me this incredible book cover, which later on became the basic lobby card for the documentary, which was made based on the book. So, I mean, it's like, how fortunate can, a situation become? My idol has made the cover for my book, my life's work, and now that's turned into a movie, and now they're using the same artwork to put on the basic DVD cover and lobby card for the actual movie itself, which is based on the book. So it's like, man, it's like beyond grateful. I mean, I just thank you, God, for this opportunity. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Yeah.
Well, somebody else we mentioned was Robert Williams. Now, Robert Williams, he done, a lot of hot rod paintings, and he blurred the line between, low art and high art. And could we say the same with you when you got into the tattooing world and you moved beyond, your typical sailor tattoos, were prominent on sailors or bikers of the early days, and you brought this kind of clash of cultures, this low and high art hybrid, would you say? Is that what you were attempting?
I suppose. I mean, I don't know if it was a conscious sort of decision on my part or if it was more just something that was, I really believe in sort of the hand of fate, and I believe in destiny. Right. And, I believe that everything is, sort of preordained in a, very ephemeral sort of way. And, I guess, that I'd acquired these skills as just a basic journeyman tattooist, where I was, just doing what tattoo artists did in those times, which was just, the standard iconography of tattooing and just carving these little images onto people and making money for it, and being able to travel the world and, just get on with your lifestyle. So that was really my introduction to tattooing, was just the basics. And then at some point, that sort of coincided with my just weird mindscape, and also coinciding with, the fact that I wound up in New York City after traveling the world and, as a tattooer, and before that. And then I ended up at this particular time and place in New York when, punk rock was happening and people like the Ramones were around and getting tattooed. And suddenly, I sort of just developed this weird style of sort of urban hieroglyphics, neo-tribal, abstract, wild style sort of tattoo design work that seemed to make itself very well accepted. Found a good nest of acceptance in the context of the kind of people who were changing rock and roll and changing design styles on other, mediums, and, people like Robert Williams. And, I just found my tribe amongst sort of a lot of revolutionary sort of artists, musicians, actors, crazy writers, and people like that. So, I sort of moved into a realm beyond just the standard sort of meat and potatoes of tattooing, and started doing some stuff that was kind of outside the box of standard tattoo design, and that found a lot of acceptance in this sort of subculture of early 80s New York City punk rock, fuck the world kind of aesthetic.
The pre-Giuliani
And,
New York,
Yeah.
42nd Street, the grindhouses.
Yeah, I was just in the right place at the right time with the right sort of approach to something that would later go on to sort of help nudge tattooing a few steps, into the beyond, and then the magazine opportunity came along, to where I, was given this magazine project to become a managing editor of the world's first big glossy mainstream tattoo magazine. And
International Tattoo Art.
yeah, and in that context I was able to sort of, I was already doing stuff that was sort of, beyond, the standard tattoo thing. I was doing some, I guess, a sort of adventurous design work that nobody really had ever associated with tattooing before. And then with the magazine, I was able to start putting this stuff out there in the context where it was actually had an audience, a wide audience. And I wound up being, sort of having a very influential hand in, in the direction that tattooing would start to go.
Well, speaking of that and talking about like acceptance and having this tattoo art magazine, because when you started doing it in New York City, tattooing was still illegal, and it wasn't until I believe the mid to late 90s when it was legalized. At the time, doing what you were doing, you had like a revolving door of famous people coming into your tattoo parlor. At that point, did you actually think it was going to be legalized? And in a sense, did you not want it to be legalized because it felt like kind of a more special thing before it went mainstream, for lack of a better term?
Well, I certainly wasn't pushing it for it to be legalized. That was not I didn't really have a stake in that battle. I didn't have a dog in that fight. Mm-hmm. It was not something I was pushing for on any level at all, because I've always considered myself somebody who's much more comfortable living in the underworld, the shadows, outside. I'm an outsider. I've always been an outsider all my life. So I was certainly not going to be the guy that was going to the city and begging them to, legalize my nefarious, trade and sort of open my secular little world up to the scrutiny of, mainstream culture. I didn't give a shit one way or the other. But what I did was I was, through my own, means of expression and, my own situation as being, somebody in the limelight, I suppose, you could say, because I was garnering a lot of attention through the magazine and through the kind of people that I was tattooing, famous people, and then, being on television and being offered opportunities to, sort of take the thing into the public eye. I was willing to do that just because it was good for business. And I thought, well, if you're going to do something, you might as well let people see what you're doing so that you can do more of it, and get paid. But it was never my intention to, sort of legalize or legitimize tattooing in any mainstream context. It just happened as a consequence of my own, high visibility at the time. Suddenly other people, other interests, other forces were, behind the scenes going, well, if he could be all famous and, having his stuff, out there where everybody can see it, then why can't we do that? And so they pushed for the legalization of tattooing because basically they were a bunch of envious cunts and they wanted to eat off of my plate, which, fair enough, I'm sitting there having a banquet and they're scrambling around for crumbs on the floor. So of course they'd want to sit at the table.
Well, you previously mentioned, you were the first tattoo artist on late night TV, which was the David Letterman show. How did that come about?
It came about as things do when you're in the public eye, to the extent that I was. I was a known entity there, in the late 80s, early 90s. I ran the most, sort of high profile, well-established, well-organized sort of underground tattoo establishment in in the world.
Yeah, fun city.
Certainly in the secular world of New York tattooing, I was the guy that was, putting it out there. And I had the magazine, I was doing interviews, the TV people would come around once in a while and want to interview me. And I'd always say yes. I've always said yes to everything that comes my way. And so I was a known entity. And eventually, I don't know, David Letterman wanted to do a tattoo-oriented skits because they thought that would be clever, or I don't know, somebody brought the idea to him. I have no idea. They contacted me and said we want.
Did they take it serious, or was it like, oh, who are these underground weirdos? Was it?
I think it was a mixture of both. I think it was a little bit of both. It was all tongue in cheek. It was not derogatory in any sense. I didn't find it to be condescending or degrading or derogatory, but at the same time, it was humorous. It was not anything heavy like, the deep significance of the the anthropological arts,
It's a gig.
Yeah, it was, it was David Letterman. It's a late night TV show that, it's for cheap entertainment and laughs and shits and giggles. And I think it was done tastefully and humorous, but not in a condescending fashion. I was grateful for it. I thought it was great. And it wound up, that clip wound up being, inserted into the documentary that they did about me. And I thought it fit in really well to sort of emphasize just how mainstream things were becoming in my world,
Well, you were in Tightrope with Clint Eastwood around this same time.
Yeah, that was earlier, actually. That was way earlier. That was before I became super famous.
Was there a moment when you were doing that film where you're like, oh, I'm kind of in my parents' footsteps here. I'm on the screen.
Well, I don't think I considered that, the irony of that sort of situation until much later. I mean, I'm perfectly comfortable with those sort of contemplations now at this stage of my life because I can look back over it and say, wow, that's pretty cool. Obviously, there's some trace of the hand of destiny in these, happenings. These occurrences. But, at the time, it was just like, oh, these movie guys want to come and film a scene and pay me a bunch of money to put me in a movie with Clint Eastwood. Great. Give me the money. I could do this. I've always been a pirate like that. So, but I didn't think of it as anything terribly unusual or, out of the ordinary because, I've never been starstruck, even though I loved Clint Eastwood. And even then, I knew who Clint Eastwood was. I'd loved the Dirty Harry movies. And I was like, oh, cool, Clint Eastwood, yeah.
So it wasn't actually like a kind of big ambition to go and do this. It was just kind of someone you were offered something like through happenstance that just happened to come about. And you thought, yeah, why not get involved?
Exactly. Well, they just came to the tattoo shop one day and they said I was running a tattoo shop in New Orleans. And, wasn't my shop. It was somebody else's shop, but I was basically the manager and the main tattooers there. And they came into the shop one day, some guys in suits, and said, oh, we're scouting locations for a movie. This would be the perfect place. And I was like, yeah, you could do that. And then the guy looked at me and he said, have you ever done any acting? And I was like, I'm a tattoo artist, but I did all kinds of acting in Brazil. I was on soap operas there. I just made it up out of, I was like, yeah, sure, I can act, I didn't even mention who my parents were or anything. I just was like, yeah, I could do that. And they were like, oh, great. Well, here's a copy of the script. Here's the part we're looking to audition people for. You want to take a look at this? And so I went and read the thing, and they had me come in and do a little whatever they do, an audition where they film you saying the lines and this and that. And so I did that. And then they called me back again to do it again. And then they said, hey, okay, so you've got the part. We're going to film at such a time and such a date. And you're going to play this part opposite Clint Eastwood. And I was like, woo, okay, great. So that's how that came about. It just seemed like it was something to do.
So how are you navigating this world at the moment? Like, previously you mentioned, you had this drug issue, this alcohol issue. You're dealing in, the gritty New York, your tattoo parlor, Fun City. If I believe I'm right in saying this, the door of Fun City had an armored door. You had a gun strapped under your chair. You had Hell's Angels coming in. You had a mixture of people from the high to the low to the all stratas of society. How are you navigating this with a drug or an alcohol habit?
Well, as a somebody with, the condition, living with the condition of chronic alcoholism or chronic drug addiction. I mean, basically a real alcoholic and a real drug addict is not partying. What we're doing is we're self-medicating.
Right.
So I was using liquor and drugs to be able to function in this world, because without it, everything was just not doable. The sounds were too loud, the colors were too bright, the people were just too annoying, everything was just a little bit off kilter, and the medication that I took to make life, doable for me was for many years alcohol and drugs. So, I was very functional in that context until the wheels fell off, many years later. It starts out as a lot of fun. And then over the course of time, it becomes fun with problems. And then after a while, it just becomes problems at every turn, and you're still seeking the fun, and the fun just goes away. And then you just have the problem of trying to just maintain that delicate balance of some sort of dubious stability that allows you to just get up every morning and face another day. And you need that medicine just to avoid going completely sideways.
What exactly was the tipping point? What was the breaking point when you realized, this lifestyle, it was starting to consume you, you were becoming like self-destructive? When did you think, right, I need to get out of this, I need to break this cycle, I need to just change my life up? What was the point when that thought occurred to you first time?
Well, that thought occurs to you again and again and again almost every day for years and years and years, until you find that one particular moment in time when suddenly it becomes imperative. I mean, that thought that I can't go on like this, and this sucks, and I can't live anymore, and I got to stop, but I don't know how. That thought is a constant. I mean, in the mind of anybody like me who really, was deeply, deeply disturbed in the grips of an addiction. That's a thought that goes with us constantly. At least it did with me, but it wasn't imperative until it became imperative. And I can't say what makes that happen, but, I tell people who are struggling with alcoholism, just keep going. For God's sake, don't stop. Don't try to stop. Just keep going.
Hit rock bottom.
Because you won't really have what it takes to stop until you find that magical place in hell when it's imperative, when you've hit, like you said, rock bottom. And so, after many years of hitting many, 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 many bottoms on a daily basis, the bottom came to me when just through a confluence of circumstances, I found myself at that jumping off place where it's like, okay, you're going to die. If you take another drink, you must stop now. And at that point, I became willing to ask for help and reached out to people I knew that were involved in, recovery. And they guided me into that way of life. And I'll be eternally grateful for that, because that's where everything changed. That's where everything, just changed. And with that change, I had to drop everything I was doing and reformulate the entire structure of my existence. And that's when I stepped away from tattooing for the better part of 20 years. I got rid of the shop. I closed, all my affairs. I moved to Brazil, and I found it imperative in order to fully, embrace my recovery from a life of tremendous suffering, self-inflicted, disasters, one after the other, I found it imperative to simplify everything, move to Brazil, and begin to do this sort of archaeological dig into the depths, the horrifying, dirty, decrepit, traumatic depths of my own existence, my own soul, my own life's history. And that's when I started writing. And, I spent the better part of 20 years unearthing all these skeletons and bones and, horror stories and traumatic events, and just going back through my entire life with a fine-tooth comb in this sort of capacity as somebody writing these memoirs that became, published as Scab Vendor and Homeward Bound, and also Narcissa, which was the first book I wrote that just was very imperative to write, because in the course of all this digging, I got sort of hijacked into this crazy relationship that brought me back to the wounds and scars of growing up with an alcoholic mother. So basically, I just married my mother with this insane crack whore, and had to recreate all that trauma to sort of come to certain conclusions about, my own traumas and my own dark, wounded places. And so, it just became a way of life, just self-examination and looking deep into the dark corners of my psyche that had basically driven me to drink and drugs for a lifetime, because I was unwilling to look into those places. It was just too painful to face any of my, resentments and traumas, and just basically required that, that sort of digging for me. I became willing to do the work and open up the wounds and go deep inside and start unearthing all this shit that eventually, through the grace of God, became, works of literature that have sort of left a positive mark on the world, despite my own best efforts to destroy everything in my life.
Well, that brings up the point, because I was once reading an interview with you, and you were on about kind of the writing process, and you once remarked that with your writing, you attempt to step outside of your ego and see yourself from an objective point of view, and you'll be able to write about yourself in a sense as you're writing fiction. Now, how hard is this process? Like, seeing yourself from a more objective point of view, did it reveal anything about yourself that you weren't necessarily conscious of before?
Everything.
Seeing yourself from a completely different vantage.
Yeah, I mean, because, the ego, is a tremendous bodyguard, not only for our survival instincts of, sex, society, and security, but it's also, in the case of an alcoholic or a drug addict, it's also the bodyguard for all the, the heinous character flaws that go with our condition. And so this ego needs to be sort of put in a proper place so that it doesn't run amok and destroy our lives. And so the process of stepping out of my attachment to my little pity-ridden story and being able to look at it from a somewhat objective perspective, it takes me out of my story and puts me in a place where I'm able to see things with an objectivity that, has a certain resemblance to humility. In other words, I'm able to step outside myself to see myself, because if I'm within myself, contained little vision of things, I came to discover that self does not have the capacity to reveal self to self.
Right.
I'll say that again, because it's a mind-blowing concept to me. But, I found that self does not have the ability to reveal self to self. So the
Right.
only way I'm going to be able to see that self with any degree of honesty and objectivity is to find some device by which I could step outside of myself, even just for a moment, and make that self, character into like a fictional character that I can write about. Almost, that's why a lot of my books, are written in the third person.
Yeah.
Like
Chicano.
he does this, and Cigano goes here, and he goes there, and he says this, and he feels that. That was a helpful device for me to be able to tell the story with the greatest degree of honesty that I could muster.
So it's kind of like an ego death in a sense.
Well, I wouldn't say it's an ego death in the sense that ego does not die. It cannot die. It dies with the body.
We're fucked.
As long as the body is alive, the ego is in place, and it has, remarkable recuperative powers. Even when it gets smashed to smithereens, it reconstructs immediately, kind of like that character in the Terminator movies, where it gets blasted to smithereens and then it just reconstructs and it's back. That's how I see ego, as this indomitable force that cannot possibly die. So the best we can do with it is find a way to put it in its proper place, because it is there for a purpose. I believe that God created, the human creature with a ego as a survival tool, because the ego is what enables us to run when there's a fucking tiger leaping towards us.
It's a self-preservation mechanism, essentially.
It is, but in the case of an alcoholic, it becomes intertwined with the disease and the character flaws of the alcoholic character, and then it becomes this evil twin that basically it becomes a situation where the bodyguard takes over the boss, and ties the boss up and throws him in a corner, and now the bodyguard is running the show. So you can't have that, obviously, because it's not meant to be that way, but that's what has to be smashed again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And that can only be done through, certain tricks that we learn through prayer and meditation and contemplation and, actions that we take to sort of rebel against this bloated taskmaster of an ego. When we get outside of ourselves by helping someone else, by concerning ourselves with the welfare of others, by doing things that are, selfless, by taking selfless actions, such as, sharing our story with the world with no ulterior motive. I never expected to make any money off my books. Money or remuneration on a material, sort of basis was never even the slightest most motivation for me writing all these things. I know how to make money. I can tattoo, and I can make people happy, and I can do, great tattooing, and I can get paid handsomely. So, I'm a pirate. I know how to make money. I've always known how to make money. I was a hungry child. I was neglected and abandoned as a child, and, abused, tortured psychologically. So, I became very apt at the art of survival and taking care of my own material needs, and, grew a tremendous ego as a result of that. And that ego, in that sense, has been a terrible, tremendous amigo.
Got you through the hard times.
It's got me through everything, and I'm a very, very crafty survivor, and I know how to make money. But when it comes to saving my soul, money never even entered into the picture, never even entered into the equation. The books that I've written and published were purely labors of love. You could not have offered me $1 billion to alter one word of my story, because that's never been a concern to me. I've never been willing to sell my soul for any amount of money, and I never will. I know how to make money, but that's not my concern as an artist. As an artist, I have to be truthful and honest and vulnerable. Yeah. And I have to, that's where I feel like I'm I'm doing God's work. I mean, that sounds corny, but, you know, through the process of sharing my experience, strength, and hope with the world, with all the good and bad and the ugly involved in that, you know, it's where in alcoholic recovery, you know, we are literally healing the sick and raising the dead, starting with ourselves. And then we share these experiences with others, and, you know, whoever might be able to benefit from those experiences, then, you know, thank God that I've been able to contribute something of value to this world, because for most of my life I was just a self-seeking, you know, scumbag, you know, because that's what an alcoholic generally is. And so, you know, now it's time for me to atone for all those years of selfishness and, you know, self-aggrandizing actions by doing something that contributes something of depth and weight and value to, you know, whatever art form has been gifted to me as a medium.
And it's clearly worked for you, because if you look on the blurb on your book, the praise for your work, you have Rolling Stone, Jonathan Shaw is the next Bukowski, your friend Johnny Depp, Shaw's works rank with the best. Jim Jarmusch, Jonathan Shaw's writing is one hell of a wild ride through the bizarre netherworld of our own damaged consciousness, which is essentially what you're talking about.
Yeah, my favorite blurb out of all of them, I mean, I love them all, but my favorite one is the one Iggy wrote, because he's such a poet, and his was my favorite of them all. I mean, I love them all, and I'm so grateful for each and every one of them, but I think Iggy's was like the you know, the cherry on top.
I can tell everybody what Iggy Pop said. He said, Jonathan Shaw is the great nightmare anti-hero of the new age.
Yeah, just one sentence.
It's one hell of an epithet.
Just one sentence, and so perfectly constructed, because, you know, Iggy is above all, you know, an amazing poet. I mean, they all are. Everybody that wrote these generous sentences of praise for me, they're all great. But just my personal favorite is Iggy's, because it's just so short and sweet and impactful. And, you know, what a blessing. And I'm so grateful for, you know, all my friends and supporters and fans and, you know, just well-wishers along the way. I've been, you know, just so blessed to have run into so many amazingly talented, kind, generous souls, you know, in my journey. I'm you know, I've been truly blessed, you know, so what can I say? You know, I just have to live up to that now as best I can.
It kind of makes the point, though, through the downtimes, through the seediness, as you say, you've made these connections, you've made these friends, and it's kind of, you've transcended that aspect. Because was it through your shop you probably met Johnny Depp, Jim Jarmusch, possibly Iggy Pop?
Yeah, you know, it's all part, you know, it's all sort of part of the whole bigger, you know, picture. I mean, I actually met Johnny before that.
Okay.
Almost 40 years ago, and we were friendly, and then I did a tattoo on him, and then we stayed friendly, and then, you know, we had a lot of things in common outside of tattooing. You know, it's one of the great friendships of my life. I mean, I consider him a brother. I never had an actual brother, and I guess neither did he, even though he had a brother by blood, but they're not that close. But, you know, to this day, Johnny and I are, you know, we were kind of like twin souls. You know, we've been a tremendous influence on each other over the years and over the decades. It's, you know, a relationship that's going on 40 years now. And, you know, so that's, you know, that's not necessarily, tattooing might have been a minor catalyst in bringing some of these relationships together, but over the years, they've developed into a much deeper sort of, you know, with every one of these artists, you know, Joe Coleman, Robert Williams, fucking Joe, you know, like Jim Jarmusch, you know, all these people that wrote generous praise for my books, you know, they read my books, and they've known, you know, they've read my life, and they know me as a friend and a fellow, you know, seeker of whatever we seek as artists. So, you know, these are friendships that way transcend the whole tattooing context.
Can I ask what the Death is Certain Club is? I am curious. I had to ask you. Or is it secret?
No, it ain't secret. It's just there was a particular time and space where circumstances brought several people together. It was me, it was Johnny Depp, it was Iggy Pop and Jim Jarmusch, and we all sort of were thrown together in a certain very special time and place, and sort of our meeting place. We'd spend a lot of time together. We'd go out to dinner, we'd hang around, we'd do this, we'd do that, we'd go to places together. And we were just like this little sort of mini family that sort of fell together at a certain time and place in New York City. And it all somehow centered around my private tattoo shop at the time. It was before I opened the big mainstream shop, but I had a private atelier that was also Fun City, and that was where I sort of received people by appointment. And there was, a lot of celebrity types or, artist types coming and going through that spot. And that was what, at the time, it's where I lived. It was my home. It was my, my studio, my art gallery. It was everything. Just this little place, this little underground basement that everybody else found to be sort of charming, in this weird sort of underground way. And so we all just congregated there, and, everybody got tattooed. Iggy saw this design in my portfolios of antique tattoo flash, and he saw this design that was a skull and crossbones with the words "Death is certain." And he was like, wow, man, that's really cool, and he loved that design. And so we all decided to get it tattooed on us. And all of us got the tattoo. I did the tattoo on all of us. I did it on myself. I did it on Johnny. I did it on Jim. And when it was Iggy's turn, he was like, no, man, I don't think I want to get tattooed, man. I'm okay. I'm good without one. So we were like, well,
the guy who cut himself on stage couldn't get the tattoo.
Well, I don't think it was about that. I think he just didn't want to rebrand himself at that stage of his life. But we also had this silver ring that everybody wore, because I had this skull ring that I'd been wearing for ages. And everybody really liked that ring. And so here it is.
Oh, wow, cool. Nice.
Yeah. So everybody was wearing. So I got the ring and gave one to Johnny. I gave one to Jim. I gave one to Iggy. And I carried on wearing the one I'd been wearing for years. And that was so the Death is Certain Club was somehow formed. I don't know how it got that name. But, sort of do, because it was around that tattoo. And then everybody had the ring, and the ring I still wear. Johnny's, he says he dropped it in the toilet at Jeff Beck's home in London and didn't have the courage to excavate it from there. So that's where it lives. And Iggy's got pulled off his finger by a fan when he dove into a mosh pit at some concert many years ago. And so the only people that are currently wearing this ring, like on a daily basis, is me and Jim Jarmusch. Jim wears it, and I wear it. Johnny's is, I've given him other versions of it, and they seem to get lost regularly. And Iggy's got lost, so I just gave up on them. But so that's the story of the so-called Death is Certain Club, as it were. But it was a special time and place that it represented. Actually, Johnny and I were actually talking about that the other day, about how cool those times were when we were all together in that time and space, and how we miss that camaraderie. But we all get to see each other from time to time. So actually, Iggy he made a record. He made a record called Skull Rings.
That's right. Was that based on your rings?
Of course.
Hey. There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you see the final, where the where the final credits roll on my movie, on the Scab Vendor documentary, the song that comes up is called Paraguay. And it's a song that Iggy did, one of his, on one of his more recent albums, Paraguay.
Yeah.
And that's also kind of a tribute to a conversation that we had, because I'd been living in Paraguay. In fact, that's where I met Lucas de Barros, the director of the movie. I'd been traveling through South America on a motorcycle by myself, and I ended up in Paraguay. And Lucas de Barros was filming a movie of his own somewhere near the border between Brazil and Paraguay, and that's where I actually met him. But then after that, I went on to sort of spend like 6 months living in Paraguay, and I was just tying up the editing for my first book, Narcissa, and I was just living in this room in Paraguay and writing all day long. Made some friends there, and we'd go out at night and eat, in little restaurants, and I'd explore the city and avail myself of the amazing whorehouses in Asunción. And so anyway, when I left there and I went back to Brazil and then eventually ended up back in the States, I was on the phone with Iggy, and he was like, "Yeah, so what have you been doing, man?" And I told him I'd been living in Paraguay, and he was like, "Paraguay? Tell me about Paraguay." So I told him all about my adventures in Paraguay. And next thing you know, he's writing this fucking song, and and then he wrote this song, Paraguay. And that was something that, he basically got from me.
Wow.
So you're like a conduit of art, because is Jack Sparrow not somewhat based on you and Keith Richards together?
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say it's based on me and Keith Richards together, being that we've never really been together.
Take it influences.
Well, I mean, I didn't know Keith, when I was a teenager. I used to cop dope for him, but I don't think he'd remember me, and that was a long time ago. But no, what it is, people ask me that, and I actually had this conversation with Johnny the other night, and what it is was... See, I was always a role model for Johnny, just in some strange way, just a big brother, and he always sort of fashioned a certain aspect of himself after me. The tinted glasses, the gold teeth, just his general overall look. We meld into each other. I mean, people who I've never met before, who don't even know who I am, they tell me, "You remind me of Johnny Depp." And I'm like, well, okay. And, so we've always had that sort of twin soul kind of connection where, we just resemble each other, not just externally, but in a lot of our thinking and a lot of our, just our worldview. And, we are basically the same in so many ways that it's just weird. And he, when he, for many years, he used to call me Captain Jack the Pirate. For many years, that was his nickname for me. That's way before this movie
that's
ever
before.
got made. Oh, years, decades before. His nickname for me was Captain Jack. He always called me Captain Jack.
But I believed it was like kind of Keith Richards' mannerisms, but your look, like, especially with the jewelry, because I think of Captain Jack, I think of like the dress, the clothes that he wears, and so much jewelry on. So I kind of figured, yeah, it was an amalgam of like one person's appearance and then one person's mannerisms that created the Jack Sparrow character.
Well, it's probably a lot of things, but it was basically I was the skeleton and Keith was the flesh.
Yeah.
I mean, I was definitely the foundation, and then Keith, mannerisms and accent fleshed out the character, along with other elements that I'm sure, we acquire as we go through life. Every molecule that we consume, becomes part of these characters that we present as, parts of ourselves. But, I was definitely the foundational character for that thing. I mean, hence Johnny tattooing OCJ on my arm, for original Captain Jack. So, because literally that was my name. That was my nickname for years, for decades. He called me Captain Jack. Hey, let's call Captain Jack and see what he's doing tonight, And that was his nickname for me. And then when the movie, became a thing, he insisted on using that name for the character, his character. He wrote a lot of that stuff. I mean, he wrote, Disney would give him a script and he would take the thing and rewrite the entire thing because he's an amazing writer. So he rewrote this character. He built this character. This character is him, and a big part of him in character is based on me. And he put Keith Richards into the mix and, a lot of other elements. Earlier in the episode, you mentioned that Depp was going to possibly be in a film of your book, an adaptation that you had wrote the screenplay for. What book was that for? Scab Vendor and Homeward Bound, and the rest of it. I wrote a screenplay some 20 odd years ago called Stardust, which is basically, the storyline is Scab Vendor, Homeward Bound, and then onward to books that I haven't even written yet. So bringing it up to pretty much present time. So that's a project that, Johnny and I worked together on 20 years ago, and then the movie never got made. And it's probably a good thing that it didn't, because at the time it would have been a movie and I probably wouldn't have been prepared to be involved, with something of that nature on a level of, I don't know, certain emotional or artistic maturity. But now it's sort of coming back around and presenting itself as, a project that we're still kind of interested in making, maybe not as a movie, but more of a scripted series. We'll see how that works out, but we've been having discussions about that, and maybe it'll happen now. It's about time, so. Isn't that curious? You've kind of lived your life, as you said, dashing around and trying to escape your upbringing. And in a sense, now that your life is, moved forward and you've transgressed that almost, you're almost in the position that your father was also, but you're just better equipped to deal with it. Well, it's almost like that pool. You can't remove that pool. No, you can't. No, you can't. You have to embrace it fully. And that's pretty much what I'm about at this stage of my life, and if Johnny was to play me, he would equally have to play my father as well. And now with, CGI and all that sort of thing, that's entirely doable. So, we're talking about this, and, we'll see what happens. There's a poignant moment in the documentary, and it's near the end, and we're talking about your father and, how things come full circle in a way. And I think he's dying, or he's very old, and you visit him, you have your tape recorder, and you're saying, Dad, I love you. And he won't reciprocate that. Yeah, he was a very damaged soul, tortured soul in so many ways, and, could not face the son that he put into this world, because it represented his failure on many levels as a, just as a humanitarian, and also, probably reopened the wounds, his own father wounds, because he was also abandoned and, sort of traumatized by, the abandonment that he suffered at the hands of his own father. So for whatever reason, he became very, just a very unhappy old man, unable to really deeply, reconcile himself with his own issues, and never really resolved many of those issues before his death. He died trying in the best way he possibly could, but, he was very, very, shut. The doors to his heart were shut and locked under 1,000, levels of, of just pain and, unresolved trauma of his own. And, he was a brilliant man, a genius in so many ways, but he was unable to transcend, the pains of his own existence. And, subsequent to his passing, I've had to do a lot of work with, ritualistic plant medicine therapy and things like that to sort of hopefully unburden his soul, so that he can move on into whatever space he needs to move on to. And, I can also, heal some of the wounds
Yeah.
of, my journey. And it's just an ongoing study, really is what it is. But, yeah, it was, I think that aspect of the movie is something that obviously is going to resonate
I think so.
deeply with other people who have shared similar parental wounding. And at the same time, I had a comment from a tattoo artist the other day who watched the movie at home. Just now it's available on platforms to watch, not anywhere, but in the United States anyway. And this tattoo guy that I was talking with the other day, he said he loved the fucking movie. He watched it at home and he called me to tell me how much he loved the movie. And then he told me, but my girlfriend hated it. And I was like, well, why did she hate it? And he was like, well, it was that bit about your father. She couldn't watch that because it triggered her. Because obviously she had a similar relationship with her father that she was not prepared to acknowledge or deal with. And she was just like, oh, this is horrible. Ew.
Hit too close to home, basically.
Yeah. So it's like anything in my work. My motto has always been to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable.
Yeah.
So obviously I disturbed somebody's comfort zone by exposing, that reality that I have, managed to sort of reconcile my with to somebody who has not and does not want to even go there. And I'm sure there's legions of people on this earth that are living entirely in conscious lives and do not want to re-examine the pain of their childhood wounds, because it's not a pleasant task. It's not for it's not for amateurs. It's not for the faint of heart. So if you can keep those doors closed, keep that fucking keep the lid on that Pandora's box on as long as you possibly fucking can, because once you open that shit, you're going to be in a world of fucking pain. But, like they say, no pain, no gain. And I believe that spiritually, if you don't face the pain, it will present itself in all sorts of inappropriate, embarrassing ways in your life. So, you got two choices, smother the pain as best you can and smother your fucking soul with it. Or, open the door to hell and go in and shake hands with the devil, because at the end of that, you'll be free of a lot of encumbrances. So that's pretty much the heart and soul of my philosophy anyway.
But I think one of the most interesting aspects of that scene is it's not just you trying to point the finger at your father, because what you do is you don't let yourself off the hook, because it's there where we find that you're drawing the parallel between your own relationship with your own son, who you were in his younger years a major presence in his life, and it kind of dawned on you. And I think you say in that moment, it's like, I was even worse than my father in some aspects.
Yeah, because that's the curse that was passed on to me. That was the only point of reference that I had. What the fuck is fatherhood? I have no concept. I have no concept, no clue, not the fucking slightest, foggiest notion of what the fuck fatherhood even is, because I had no experience with that, because I never had a father. So not having had a father, how am I going to have any point of reference when it comes to being this thing called a father? I had no clue. There was no clue whatsoever to what that could be. So in that sense, of course I was as bad a father as my own father. I made no attempt to contact my son. I was in the depths of, drug addiction and alcoholism and running around the world like a fucking, singed cat. And, eventually when, it all came to a head and I had to get sober or die, that set me on this inward journey where I had to reconcile myself with who was my father and what does that mean, and then make a commitment to attempting to be less of an asshole to my son than my father was to me. So at that point, at that point he was like 18 years old and I was in my late 40s, and I went to South America and sought him out and began to have a haphazard relationship with this young man. And, it was hit and miss, and it was, sort of difficult, but we sort of bonded in certain ways. And then over the course of years and different visits, we've become closer and,
Good.
mended that wound as best as two wounded people can. And it's been, it's been hit and miss. It's been up and down. It's been whatever it's been. But I would say that today, we have a strong bond with each other. I mean, I'm sure it could be better, but we weren't given that opportunity. Mm-hmm. So, we are definitely doing the best we can with the material at hand, and we love each other and we respect each other and we like to see each other. We enjoy each other's company. We live in totally different worlds. We're entirely different sorts of people, but we do have a deep understanding of each other. And, I think it just gets better over the years, the more we get to see each other and interact. We have a close sort of bond, thank God, that, could it be better? Well, sure it could if we would have been normal people, but we're not. So, being that we are who we are and our circumstances are what they are, I'd say we're doing pretty good. Me and my son and I have, formed, a friendship and a love that's certainly an upgrade from what, I had with my father. So, I could say that, that's one little feather in my cap that I can say, well, I might not have been Father of the Year, and probably never will be, but we have a pretty good relationship today, albeit at great distance. There's a lot of time and distance between our visits, but that's okay too, because it is what it is. But we do love each other and we enjoy each other's company, and I think that's pretty good because with my father it was like pulling teeth, So I think that's the best. That's the closest thing to a happy ending for that fucking story,
It's almost like you've tried to put the impetus on your life, if we look at the literary tradition, to make it your life story a redemption arc rather than a tragedy, which it could have easily been.
Well, I think humor plays a big part in that. You have to have that ironic glance at some of the most tragic, excruciating situations, that people face in their, existential journey. So I was being interviewed when my first book came out, and they translated it into Spanish, and then there was a big book tour around Mexico with the Spanish language edition of Narcisa, which was my first book. Yeah. And that book received a lot of really positive critical acclaim, even though it was one of the darkest books ever written. I think it would make, the likes of Bukowski cringe, It's pretty dark fucking
Which
book.
is hard to do.
Yeah. And, but it had some, success and acclaim in Mexico, and they sent me all over Mexico with a book tour. And, I speak really fluent Spanish because I kind of grew up on the road in Mexico. So it was, I took to that like a duck to water and traveled around Mexico with the book, going to different venues and doing the book tour thing. And at one point I was being interviewed by a journalist, I think it was from the New York Times book review, and he asked me how would I define the genre of my writing. And I said, I've never given much thought to genre, but I suppose if you wanted to pigeonhole my work into some genre, I'd have to create my own. And then I just heard the words come out of my mouth saying I would define it as slapstick tragedy. So that's something that just, I think that probably could best define my sort of genre as a writer, and not just me. I mean, some of my favorite writers, I would consider them masters of slapstick tragedy. One of my best friends, and also one of my favorite living writers, is a guy named Jerry Stahl.
Yeah, Permanent Midnight.
Permanent Midnight,
Yeah.
and many other brilliant books. And slapstick tragedy, that's his currency as a writer. I believe, he's just got such, I mean, I have laughed myself, like snotty reading passages of his books where he's talking about some of the most tragic, horrifying, things, and yet with such incisive humor, just this dark, cynical, hilarious, fucking just bone-shattering humor that, you just break out in a cold sweat laughing yourself to tears with some of this material. So, that's what I try to always, I don't try, I mean, I actually manage to insert this kind of spirit into my work so that, there's plenty of opportunities for humor, because my favorite writers have always written some of the most humorous shit in a very dark, context. Celine, Henry Miller, all of them, these are my Bukowski. I mean, all of my sort of mentors, in the writing game, are people that sort of have that worldview, that perverse sort of talent for expressing the most, tragic events in extremely humorous terms. Yeah.
So where do we go from here? What book's coming up next? After, you've had this run with a documentary, we've had Scab Vendor, we've had Homeward Bound. What's next what's next on the game?
I've got a lot of unfinished writing that I put down several years ago, and I've just put writing aside several years ago, and I started back into, visual arts, and I've been drawing a lot and tattooing a lot, and it's kind of a form of escapism for me, because at some point the writing just became so overwhelming, the depth and weight of so much material that's floating around in my fucking, my fucking skull.
He did something more instantaneous.
I just needed a little bit of instant gratification, which I derive especially through tattooing, because, I'll show up someplace, I'll make friends with a bunch of cool people, I'll make tattoos on them that they love and makes them happy and that I can be proud of. And it's a party, and it's, a sort of fraternity of man, and I have a good time, and it's instant gratification. I don't have to wait and laboriously sit all alone in a dark room writing and writing and writing. So I stepped away from that several years ago, and now I feel like I'm being lured back into it. Partly because the movies come out, partly because my friend Jerry Stahl has started to motivate me to get on this thing called Substack, which I don't know anything about, but it seems like he's got this Substack thing going, and he's getting his work out there every day and writing a lot and getting immediate response and gratification from his audience. And he's like, you got to do this, man. And so now I'm slowly starting to look in that direction. So I think it's, I'm probably going to begin writing again. I've got a lot of unfinished writing. I've got the third book to the Scab Vendor series that I started years ago and got about 5 chapters in. And then I was like, oh, this is too much. I can't.
You need some levity.
There's too much to write about. It's not even that. I got overwhelmed by the material to the point where I got scared and said, it's too much material. I don't know how to put this all together. I don't have the head for this. And I stepped away. So I think I'm going to have to go back into it. And then there's a lot of short stories that I've already written that I never really published. And I just, got sidetracked by other projects. And now I'm getting ready to unearth that stuff and polish it up and put that on a Substack and find out how that thing works and start doing it. And then, there's other projects. There's this, there's the project that I want to do with Johnny. Should the stars line up and and support that project, I want to make this this other film related project adaptation of the stories in Scab Vendor and turn it into something for a much wider audience, because I think I've written these books, and I can say with all humility that they are great books, because I don't credit myself for their
got a great descriptive way of language.
Well, I can say with humility that I've written great books, because I don't believe I wrote them without divine intervention. So I can, say that all credit, any success that I've had as a writer is purely the success of my higher power, and not my fucking stupid little, fly fucking ego. It's actually a power greater than myself that's inspired all this work, and all credit goes to that power, that higher power. So, through that, in that context, I can honestly say with humility that yes, these are great works of literature, and they will always be defined as such, in generations to come. But that being said, nobody really reads a book today in this current world culture that we live in. I mean, it used to be back in the, in the 50s and the 40s and the 30s, great writers were like fucking rock stars. They were, they were supported by the audience of their generation. Today, it ain't like that. Today, people want movies. They want,
TV shows.
TikTok, TV shows. They want stuff that's instant. People don't have the time or the discipline to sit down and read a great book. I mean, sure, there are bookworms that do, but it's not a mainstream thing like it was once in the past. With technology, it has to morph into this newer medium, which is really the film, the TV sort of medium. And TV is where it's really happening now. Not the shit TV of our youth, but the real, scripted series TV culture that's, Breaking Bad, all that sort of thing. There's really some great stuff being put out. So I want to do something in that context. And if the stars line up for that to happen, then, I'm going to do what I can to suit up and show up and work on that, and God willing, that will, happen. And if it does, it will certainly reach a far wider audience than any of my books have, and, that's another reason why I'm, pretty happy with the fact that the documentary is out there, even though it's not, it's not like, some blockbuster movie, but who cares? It's out there, and it's there for public, inspection. At least in North America, people can see it. I hope they will sell the rights for Europe and South America eventually and have it distributed in those places. But
hope so.
But for now, the USA seems to be responding okay to it. It's being watched by people, and that's a good thing. Yeah.
Well, I hope everybody who listens to this goes out and sees, especially currently our North American listeners. It can be viewed on Amazon Prime, for example. So it's definitely worth checking out. And if you haven't already checked out Jonathan Shaw's works, well, he's got Narcissa, he's got Scab Vendor, he's got Homeward Bound. You've got a plethora of material already out there. So if you're listening, go check it out. But Jonathan, it's been great speaking to you. Do you have any last road-weary words you've learned along the way that you'd like to impart on anybody listening to this?
Lately I've been thinking a lot about what Charles Bukowski said on his gravestone. It's inscribed the words, "Don't try." And, I always wondered about what that was supposed to mean. But now I start to get it. It's like, don't try, just do, and leave the results to, up to the universe. Because, try as I may, nothing's going to happen without the cooperation of forces much greater than myself, and it's like I am just too old and too tired to try to force my will upon, the creator of all things. So I honestly strive to not try. That being said, back in the day, we used to, put our stuff out there in tattoo magazines and books and stuff like that. today it's all Instagram,
Yeah.
at least in the tattoo world and pretty much any world that deals with, public expression, it's on Instagram. So if anybody wants to follow me on Instagram, the name is Jonathan Shaw, and I'm there as Jonathan Shaw Works.
And we'll have all the information down in the description.
Yeah, so that it's always good to get these random messages from people that that have read my books and have something to say about it. That's really that's the big payoff, is the interaction that I get to have with my fellow human beings through, putting my shit out there. It's the big payoff is that I actually get to interact with other tortured souls like myself, and we can form friendships and bonds in that context. So anybody who's read my books, feel free to comment or criticize all you want, because I'm always here to listen. Thanks.
And that brings this episode to a close with those wise words from Jonathan Shaw. So for now, you've been listening to episode 97 of In Film We Trust. I'm Liam.
I'm Wayne.
Join us next week as we discuss, dissect, and deep dive all things film, from the obscure to the mainstream.